formerly Earth. It was March 28th in the year 1862 that Union forces halted Confederates at the Battle of Glorieta Pass. This action was part of the broader movement by the Confederates to capture New Mexico and other parts of the West. This would secure territory that the rebels thought was rightfully theirs, but had been denied them by political compromises made before the Civil War. Furthermore, the cash-strapped Confederacy could use Western mines to load up its own treasury. From San Antonio, the rebels moved into southern New Mexico, which included Arizona at the time, and captured the towns of Mesilla, Diaz Ana, and Tucson. General Henry Sibley, with 3,000 troops, now moved north against the federal stronghold at Fort Craig on the Rio Grande. Sibley's forces collided with Union troops at Val Verde near Fort Craig on February 21st, but the Yankees were unable to stop the invasion. Sibley left part of his army to occupy Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and the rest of the troops headed east of Santa Fe along the Pecos River. Their next target was the Union garrison at Fort Union, an outpost on the other side of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. At Pigeon's Ranch near Glorieta Pass, they encountered a Yankee force of 1,300 Colorado volunteers under Colonel John Slough. The battle began in late morning, and the federal force was thrown back before taking cover among the adobe buildings of Pigeon's Ranch. A Confederate attack late in the afternoon pushed the Union troops further down the pass, but nightfall halted the advance. Union troops snatched victory from the jaws of defeat when Major John Chivington led an attack on the Confederate supply train, burning 90 wagons and continuing the eternity of 800 animals. With their supplies destroyed, the Confederates had to withdraw to Santa Fe. 36 men continued their eternity, 70 men were wounded, and 25 were captured. As for the Union Army, 38 men continued their eternity, 64 were wounded, and 20 were captured. After a week in Santa Fe, the rebels withdrew down the Rio Grande. By June, the Yankees controlled New Mexico again, and the Confederates did not return for the rest of the war. It was March 28th in the year 1958 that W.C Handy, the father of the blues, continues his eternity. Quote, "With all their differences, my forebears had one thing in common. If they had any musical talent, it remained buried." Unquote. So wrote William Christopher Handy in his autobiography in discussing the absence of music in his home. In his home life as a child, excuse me, but I'm not fucking retaking today. Born in northern Alabama in 1873, Handy was raised in a middle-class African-American family that intended for him a career in the church. To them and his teachers, W.C. Handy wrote, "Becoming a musician would be like selling my soul to the devil." It was a risk that young Handy decided to take. He was internationally famous by the time he wrote his 1941 memoir, Father of the Blues, although Stepfather might have been a more accurate label for the role he played in bringing blues into the music mainstream. The significance of his role is not to be underestimated. However, W.C. Handy, one of the most important figures in the 20th century American popular music history, continued his eternity in New York City on March 28th in 1958. Okay, we'll slow it down for you guys. While Handy's teachers might not have considered a career in music to be respectable, they provided him with tools that made his future work possible. Naturally blessed with a fantastic ear, Handy was drilled in formal musical notation as a schoolboy. Quote, "When I was no more than 10, unquote, Handy wrote in The Father of Blues, I could catalog almost any sound that came to my ears using the tonic sol fa system. I knew the whistle of each of the river boats on the Tennessee. Even the bellow of the bull became in my mind a musical note. In the later years, I recorded this memory in the Hooking Cow Blues." The talent and the inclination to take the traditional black music he heard during his years as a traveling musician and captured accurately and technically correct sheet music would be Handy's great professional contribution. It not only made the music that came to be called the blues playable by other professional musicians, but it also added the fundamental musical elements of the blues into the vocabulary of professional song composers. The Memphis Blues and the St. Louis Blues, jazz standards, are the most famous of Handy's own compositions. but his musical legacy can be heard in the works of composers as varied as George Gershwin and Keith Richards. More than 25,000 mourners filled the streets around Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church of the funeral of W.C. Handy, who continued eternity at the age of 85 on March 28th in 1958. It was March 28th in the year 1979 at 4 a.m. in the morning. The worst accident in the history of U.S. nuclear power industry began when a pressure valve in the Unit 2 reactor at 3 Mile Island failed to close. Cooling water contaminated with radiation drained from the open valve into adjoining buildings, and the core began to dangerously overheat. The 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant was built in 1974 on a sandbar on Pennsylvania's Susquehanna River. Hope I said that right. Susquehanna. I think I said it right. Just 10 miles downstream from the state capital of Harrisburg. In 1978, a second state-of-the-art reactor began operating on 3 Mile Island, which was lauded for generating affordable and reliable energy in a time of energy crisis. After the cooling water began to drain out of the broken pressure valve on the morning of March 28th, 1979, emergency cooling pumps automatically went into operation. Left alone, these safety devices would have prevented the development of a larger crisis. However, human operators in the control room misread confusing and contradictory readings and shut off the emergency water system. The reactor was also shut down, but residual heat from the fission process was still being released. By early morning, the core had heated to over 4,000 degrees, just 1,000 degrees short of meltdown. In the meltdown scenario, the core melts and deadly radiation drifts across the countryside, fatally sickening a potentially great number of people. As the plant operators struggled to understand what had happened, the contaminated water was releasing radioactive gases throughout the plant. The radiation levels, though not immediately life-threatening, were dangerous, and the core cooked further as the contaminated water was contained and precautions were taken to protect the operators. Shortly after 8 a.m., word of the accident leaked to the outside world. The plant's parent company, Metropolitan Edison, downplayed the crisis and claimed that no radiation had been detected off plant grounds. But the same day, inspectors detected slightly increased levels of radiation nearby as a result of the contaminated water leak. Pennsylvania Governor Dick Thornburg considered calling an evacuation. Finally, at about 8 p.m., plant operators realized they needed to get water moving through the core again and restrain the pumps. The temperature began to drop and pressure in the reactor was reduced. The reactor had come within less than an hour of complete meltdown. More than half the core was destroyed or molten, but it had not broken its protective shell, and no radiation was escaping. The crisis was apparently over. 2 days later, however, on March 30th, a bubble of highly flammable hydrogen gas was discovered within the reactor building. The bubble of gas was created 2 days before when exposed core materials reacted with superheated steam. On March 28th, some of this gas had exploded, releasing a small amount of radiation into the atmosphere. At that time, plant operators had not registered the explosion, which sounded like a ventilation door closing. After the radiation leak was discovered on March 30th, residents were advised to stay indoors. Experts were uncertain if the hydrogen bubble would create further meltdown or possibly a giant explosion. As a precaution, Governor Thornburg advised pregnant women and preschool-aged children to leave the area within a 5-mile radius of the 3 Mile Island facility until further notice. This led to the panic the governor had hoped to avoid. Within days, more than 100,000 people had fled the surrounding towns. On April 1st, our nation's 39th president, Jimmy Carter, arrived at 3 Mile Island to inspect the plant. Carter, a trained nuclear engineer, had helped dismantle a damaged Canadian nuclear reactor while serving in the U.S. Navy. His visit achieved its aim of calming local residents and the nation. That afternoon, experts agreed that the hydrogen bubble was not in danger of exploding. Slowly, the hydrogen was bled from the system as the reactor cooled. At the height of the crisis, plant workers were exposed to unhealthy levels of radiation, but no one outside 3 Mile Island had their health adversely affected by the accident. Nonetheless, the incident greatly eroded the public's faith in nuclear power. The unharmed Unit 1 reactor at 3 Mile Island, which was shut down during the crisis, did not resume operation until 1985. Cleanup continued on Unit 2 until 1990, but it was too damaged to be rendered usable again. Historic information, the roles, and documented on this audio file can be verified on history.com.